Hello and welcome to episode 50 of the Campus Pressbox podcast series, brought to you by the Four Lights FM network. I'm Ben Belden, and I am here with Damon Del Rosario. Damon, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I am hanging in there. It's been a long day, but I'm excited to get to taping this podcast. I've been looking forward to it all day. So, Damon, first of all, before we go any farther, tell the listeners where they can find your writing, where they can maybe find you on social media.
Sure. You can find my writing on campuspressbox.com. You can contact me at damon.delrosario at campuspressbox.com. And basically the only social media I'm really on is Twitter. My Twitter handle is Damo, D-A-M-O, knows as in knows things, sports. So Damo knows sports.
Great stuff. And likewise, you can find me at campuspressbox.com. I tend to write a lot about Notre Dame football and things. And you can find me on Twitter at B Belden. That's BELDEN 330. And you can find some of my other writing. I write about the Cleveland sports teams for Fansided, and I write about the Orlando Magic for amicohoops.net. All of those links and things you can find on my Twitter. So whenever you check me out on Twitter, make sure you hit follow. Do the same for Damon, and we will be good. So anyways, let's get down to the content. We are going to be talking to you about some college basketball today. Obviously, we are one day away from the start of the Sweet 16. And Damon, let me just ask you for your initial thoughts on the tournament so far. And is this perhaps the best tournament of all time with all of the wacky upsets that we've seen?
I actually, and I hate, trying to revise history or just living completely in the moment. But after watching, and I sat and watched basically all 4 days. I take off the first 2 days of the tournament typically from work and simply watch all day. And I mean, really in my memory, this is the best tournament thus far that I can recall watching.
Yeah, I must admit I'm a teacher, and while I was teaching, I had my computer pulled up and I was streaming some games. And
Nice.
every once in a while, students would be asking me, like, why do you keep looking at your computer? Because they couldn't see it. And because I usually don't teach with the computer because I'm an English teacher and we talk about literature and things. But anyways, and I had some games streaming in the background, and I'm telling you, there were a lot of great games. There were some good staggered endings of games where it seemed like there was a game ending every 5 or 6 minutes on some of the days. Some of the days, games went to overtime, so you had multiple games ending at once. And I'm sitting at home then wondering why the TV I bought doesn't have split screen on it. So it was really fun to watch. People don't care about my bracket, but I'm just going to go ahead and say that I had Michigan State winning it all in most of the brackets that I filled out. And that obviously didn't work out for me. But at the same time, I'm almost more excited that it's a wide open field and that there's these upsets more than I am mad that my bracket is ruined. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. And I mentioned, obviously, before we started, I'm a Louisville fan. So, I mean, we won just a couple of years ago, but I was kind of just having that discussion with people about, when your team's in it, and especially if they're a contender, you watch all their games, you watch from beginning to end. So sometimes you miss the other action that's going on, at least a few minutes of it. Once your game's over, you'll catch the rest. But not having them there, as much as it stinks not to have them in the tournament, being able to sit there and, like you mentioned, go from staggered finish to staggered finish. And I love the way they do it now so that all 4 games are on at once, or and then one's ending and then they kind of start up perfectly. I was able to go basically from one ending, make sure I got to True TV or TBS or whichever one had the next one, and just jump in and watch them. And yeah, between the upsets, I didn't have Michigan State, luckily. I have Virginia winning it all. So I still have some hope there. And Michigan State losing should help that cause. But watching that game, between that one, Arkansas Little Rock on the first night, I actually had Northern Iowa going one more round, so their meltdown was painful for me to watch, just because I like them, and I feel bad for the kids for what happened to them against Texas A&M. But just so many amazing finishes and kind of storylines in this tournament that it's hard really to kind of deny that for our first 2 days and then into the third and fourth days, it's got to be better than anything I've ever seen.
If you had to pick one game that you watched from last weekend that you were just glued to, what game would you say that would be?
Oh man. The Syracuse, the Michigan State, Middle Tennessee. I think I missed the first half of that because there was something else going on. I kept assuming it was going to turn around at some point. That one was certainly up there. Even though it's kind of a marquee matchup that everyone was talking about, it got less talked about later. But the Indiana-Kentucky game, just from a skill standpoint, two of the better teams, and to have that kind of a matchup in the second round, that one I pretty much watched from beginning to end, because that one kind of has the ramifications with North Carolina coming up next, and obviously two of the contenders. So that one was probably one that I was certain to watch the entire thing.
Yeah, you talked about Middle Tennessee and Michigan State. That was one of those early afternoon start games. I believe that was on Thursday, and that was one of the games that I mentioned, or that I was talking about whenever I was saying that I was streaming games while I was at work at school. Before I got to start watching that game at all, I just kind of had the scores up. I graduated from the University of Dayton, so I was watching them lose to Syracuse. And then I think I just had the scores up then, and then I saw that Middle Tennessee State was up 15-2, and I was like, oh my goodness gracious, like what's going on here? And I, like you, kind of thought that Michigan State was going to get it turned around and that they were going to right the ship. And obviously that didn't completely end up happening, but I did start streaming it then, and Michigan State started to pull back in, and I'm not sure what they were down at halftime. It was probably like 4 or 5 points. And then when they went into halftime only down like 4 or 5 or whatever it was, I kind of just said to myself, all right, we're good. Like they're going to come back. They're going to win this. And really I was surprised that Michigan State, their offense was fine. They scored 81 points in regulation. Usually that's enough to win, but to give up 90 to Middle Tennessee, that was surprising to me. I was shocked that a team that a lot of people picked to win just couldn't get the stops to a team that wouldn't have been in had they not won their conference tournament.
Right, and that's what I know. I was kind of exchanging text with one of my buddies who, like most people, had Michigan State either going to the Final Four or winning it all, and it got to that halftime. I believe it was like 41-36 or something along those lines at halftime. And I'm like, first couple minutes of the second half, here comes Michigan State. They'll knock in a couple buckets. They'll ramp up the pressure. Once they crack the seal and take the lead, they'll have it. And every single time they got to within 1 or 2, Middle Tennessee State came up with an old-fashioned three-point play. They didn't really seem like that they hit a ton of threes, but they would hit the occasional one. But they kept on attacking the basket. And I think it's one of those things that is kind of strange compared to what we used to watch in the tournament. And I think it's a combination of, we have the one and done, and for a long time we had the just flat out no one had to come to college if they didn't want to. So we're still kind of in that mode of there's less stars on the big teams. There's kind of more of an evening out of the mid-majors getting some pretty decent players, and because the high level teams have so many guys leaving early, the experience isn't there. And I think most of the mid majors are no longer as starstruck as they once were. You got to imagine, like in the 80s, if you stepped on the floor as a 15 seed and you played, say, North Carolina and they had Michael Jordan, those guys were watching him on TV. They looked up to those types of players and they sort of feared them. I don't think the mid majors fear anybody anymore.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't know how you feel about this. I don't know if you feel as if that's a positive or not. I'm not really sure really how I feel. But there's definitely been an evening out of 1 through 16. I don't think that we are too many years away from a 16 seed beating a 1 seed. I think that a time like now is when you're going to see that happen for the first time. Obviously, it has not happened yet. I believe now that Middle Tennessee State beat Michigan State, 15's beaten it I want to say 8 times. But it does make for good television when these lower ranked seeds are able to just go toe to toe with some of these bigger programs. And Danny Cunningham and I talked about this a little bit on our podcast about how teams like even Notre Dame's in a power conference, but a team like Notre Dame doesn't attract top talent as much, but they're able to compete because these other schools like the Kentuckys of the world have these one and done type players. So, and then you can apply that to my alma mater, Dayton, made an Elite Eight run a couple years ago, and
right.
You've seen it from Wichita State, and you've seen it from VCU before that, even George Mason. So Butler is another one that comes to mind. But yeah, it really makes for some good basketball. I don't know that anyone's ever going to get a perfect bracket because of it. You just think that there's going to be some basketball junkie somewhere that fills out like 200 brackets and gets one of them perfect, but it never happens. So I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much look at it as impossible. Even when I see, you jump on your ESPN or your CBS sports line kind of the second day. I mean, even after the Friday, I'm like, if someone's got a perfect bracket, it's got to be it's like a robot who just, whatever, it's fixed, because I just can't buy that anyone can again, in this day and age, pick, they're going to get Little Rock right. And then they're also going to get Stephen F. Austin right on the same day. Like, what I usually look at when I'm picking my brackets too, is that I have a propensity to look at all these, and I know when I'm looking around, sort of whipping around the regions, like I liked, for example, Buffalo to beat Miami like a couple of days before. But then I thought back on Buffalo. I'm like, okay, they didn't really beat anybody this year. Last year, they took West Virginia down to the wire in the tournament. Probably be a very similar thing. They'll lose by a few buckets. And they did. They lost by about 6 or 8, right in that range. And it's like most of those mid-majors or lower seeds, that's what happens. You get like good Stephen F. Austin, they get real close, and then they get ousted. So to be able to pick all of them and make sure that you end up with not only that, but then the right mix of the top teams, it's got to be just flat out impossible.
Right, exactly. All right, so let's take a look at some of these Sweet 16 matchups that we have left. So starting in the South region, there are 2 matchups in the South. One is number 1 seed Kansas versus number 5 seed Maryland. The other matchup is number 3 seed Miami versus number 2 seed Villanova. Let's start with Kansas and Maryland. Who do you like and why?
I have Maryland. I actually have Maryland going to the Final Four and to the championship game. So it's part of the reason why I like them. But more to the point of why is that they're probably one of the most talented teams in the country from top to bottom as far as actual roster. I know, like probably the majority of this field, and they showed it their first 2 games, they will have entire halves of games or even sometimes more where they don't play that well despite their talent, and then they'll simply turn it on. That's what they look like against Hawaii the other day. And so it's not even necessarily that I've got anything. I mean, I think Kansas is phenomenal, especially in this year where there's not really that many elite teams. They're very complete. And from what I saw them the other night, it's going to certainly be a battle. I just, again, one of those differentiators for me is that with the talent being pretty close to even, and you have an opportunity to pick someone different, that's where I've got Maryland. But if Kansas takes it to them, it wouldn't shock me.
Right. I was really high on Maryland earlier in the year. I really enjoyed watching the games that they had on ESPN. But like you said, they're a team that, they're streaky. So I actually had this matchup whenever I put my bracket together. I had this matchup as it is, and I have Kansas winning. And I can't say that I know a ton about Kansas or Maryland, but just Kansas's pedigree, and Bill Self is obviously a great coach. I think that leadership, I think, does something when it comes to tournament time. And for that reason, I like Kansas to win this. I would not at all be shocked if Maryland's won, just because they can, depending on what Maryland team shows up, they're a really good basketball team when they put it all together. So I think that's a really interesting one. But I guess we'll leave it at that. We'll see how that plays out. That game is on the 24th, which is that tomorrow? Geez, out. Yeah. So that's tomorrow at 9:40 p.m. As we're recording this here on Wednesday night. So that'll be one I have my eyes on for sure. So the other matchup in that region, like I said, Miami versus Nova. Again, two teams I don't know a ton about. What's your opinion on Miami and Nova?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't have either one of them here, but Miami, just the way Miami's played, I kind of give them the slight edge. I had Arizona making a run and then I saw how atrocious they played on that opening night. It was actually pretty embarrassing for them. But Miami, first of all, Miami Villanova is probably going to be an absolute track meet. I mean, two teams are going to shoot a ton of threes. That's Villanova's MO. Part of the reason I'm not a huge fan of them usually in the tournament is that they shoot so many perimeter shots. They don't typically have any sort of interior presence, or if it is, it's all points driven from what the guards are doing. They're penetrating and then kicking to somebody or getting an easy dunk for their lone big guys. So, Villanova is not usually one that I like their style, but having gotten here, they're playing pretty well in their first half against Iowa the other day was actually devastating. So it should be a back and forth battle. It wouldn't shock me if these two teams went into the 90s. But the slight balance that Miami has, a little bit more Tanya Jakiri in the middle. I think he's a little bit more of a threat than Daniel Echefu for Villanova. So I like Miami to get through on that one, and hopefully the two, Miami and Maryland, sort of a current ACC member and a former one, against each other in the Elite Eight.
Yeah, I like Miami as well. I got to agree with you. Villanova is very perimeter oriented. I think Miami's got some good guards that are really going to get after Villanova's guards. I really love Jim Larinaga as a coach. Heard him speak a few times. Think very highly of what he's done at Miami and how he took a program. And people don't realize how it had to have been so difficult for Miami basketball to draw fans. Being in Miami, obviously the Heat were, and I guess pretty much still are, pretty good down there. And the fact that it is Miami and there's so many things to do, the weather's distracting, all of that, and you turn on a Miami basketball game at this point, and they've got that place sold out. And so much so that I don't know if it was 2 seasons ago, is when LeBron was still in Miami, that I think LeBron and Wade and things went and they sat courtside at a Hurricanes basketball game. And I think that says a lot about where that program's going. I feel very good about Miami in this game for some of those reasons, with Jim Larinaga as a coach and just how they're on kind of the upswing as a program. So I definitely had Miami in this game. I can't remember if I had Nova or not, but I like Miami moving on in this one. So I think we're at a consensus there. All right, let's move on to the West region. We've got Oregon and Duke, the 1-4 matchup, and then we've got Texas A&M and Oklahoma. Let's start with Oregon and Duke. I'll start with my picks in this one. First of all,
sure.
I did not have Yale getting out of the first round. I had Baylor in this game instead of Duke, and I had Baylor winning it. That being said, the reason I had picked Baylor to beat Duke in that second round matchup is because the fact that Duke plays 7 guys, I think, is going to catch up to them at some point. And it may not catch up to them in this matchup with Oregon, but I don't think Duke is going – it may catch up to them whenever they play the winner of Texas A&M Oklahoma on, I guess that would be Saturday. So at some point I think Duke's going to run out of gas. I don't know that this game against Oregon's that game. So it's really hard for me to pick a winner. It's hard to pick against Coach K. I cannot say that I've watched a lot of Oregon this year. The game is being played in Anaheim, California. So as far as home court advantages, you would think maybe Oregon has a little bit of an advantage there. However, Oregon's not exactly a basketball school. So it might just be a crowd that's there to see a basketball game. So really hard to pick a winner. I guess if I had to choose one, I'd go with Duke. What say you about this one?
Like I said, I did not have I did have this matchup. I did have Yale getting out of the first round. That's part of the reason that it pained me. I did not want to pick Duke to even get to the Sweet 16 because I don't think they're the version of Duke that's going to go very far. But I actually like Oregon in this one. I wasn't sure that they'd get past the second round. It's kind of like you mentioned. I mean, I know that perception of basketball school versus football school or whatever it may be sometimes can get overblown, but I do think it has some merits. And I mean, Oregon's never really been in the position of being the 1 seed. They had that really tough game against St. Joe's, the last one, and they did survive it, which is huge. And I think at this point, I think they have a bit more athleticism and depth. And kind of like you mentioned, Duke getting worn out. When I've seen Duke lose this year, part of the reason has been sheer athleticism. They get out, run down the floor. They get beat defensively. It's not a great defensive Duke team. So I think Oregon will be able to kind of ramp up not only the pressure but then also the offense and move on to the Elite Eight in that section of the bracket.
Okay, so moving on to Texas A&M and Oklahoma. I'll go ahead and start this one also. Given what Texas A&M just survived against Northern Iowa, I have a tough time thinking that what they just overcame against Northern Iowa is a positive for them. On one hand, it might be a positive because it's kind of a wake-up call. On the other hand, it may have really just drained a lot of energy out of them. I'm not sure. Texas A&M is not a program that we've talked about in the Sweet 16 for who knows how long. I couldn't tell you. But regardless, I watched Buddy Hield just completely take over a game against VCU. I'm on record as saying that Buddy Hield is actually probably the best NBA prospect, even over my boy Ben Simmons. I can't go against Buddy Hield in this one. I think that Oklahoma is going to move on, and I think it's going to be on the heels of Buddy. I think he's going to have a big game. He's hit some big shots. He's shooting the lights out of the ball. So I think when this tournament is said and done, we're going to talk about Buddy Hield the same way that we've talked about some guys like Kemba Walker and guys who've really put on in the tournament for their teams. And I think Buddy Hield's just another game or two from entering that, college basketball legend, like even like Sam Decker of last year or Steph Curry back when he took Davidson to I think it was the Elite Eight. I think Buddy Hield's getting to that, I don't know, that pedestal, I guess you could say. So for that reason, I've got Oklahoma beating Texas A&M in this one. How about you?
Excellent. Yeah, I have Oklahoma going. Actually, I have them in the Final Four. I did not have Texas A&M actually in this spot. I had Northern Iowa, so that again was extraordinarily painful. They're really fun to watch, and I've kind of liked what they've done. They sort of gotten pushed down in the radar with the Missouri Valley Conference having Wichita State having so much success recently. Northern Iowa's had a ton of success as well. So to see them kind of, again, just fall apart like that was tough. And A&M, like I said, to their credit, they didn't quit. They certainly did not give up on that game with it out of hand. But and I don't know, like you said, I don't know if it's a deterrent for them, again, being gassed from a double overtime, maybe the emotional low. But many times we've seen in the past in the tournament, teams face that sort of adversity and scare, and they get propelled. But and I think A&M, actually, I want to say the last time they were in the Sweet 16 was in 2008 when they had AC Law, and then lost to Memphis, I believe. So just so for history's sake there, if you mark that down, I think that's the last time Texas A&M was in there. But yeah, Buddy Hield is insane, and he's been doing that all season. That game the other day was like so many others he's had this year where he just flat out, I mean, you give him even even the slightest bit of daylight, he's going to knock down every shot. And I think there was at least one play in the second half where it was getting down to like that 3-point, 5-point range. Somebody gambled on a steal. He just pump faked him, waited for them to go by, and then knocked down a three. And I mean, I think Buddy, like you said, he's gonna push them at least a couple more rounds.
Right. And a point that you were kind of touching on a little bit is that the old adage is that in order to win a tournament like this, you've got to play a clunker but still survive. And I think if we're talking about Texas A&M, that if that's maybe their one clunker, like usually you don't go 6 games, win the tournament without playing kind of poorly in one, but getting away with it, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So I guess Texas A&M might have their bad one out of their system, and they could, I don't know, rebound, because their first game against Green Bay, I mean, they did win by 27 points. It's hard to play bad and win by 27 points. But yeah, regardless, I think even all that being said, like you and we're coming to a consensus here about Buddy Hield probably leading Oklahoma past them. So we'll leave it at that and we'll move on. So moving on then to the East, we've got North Carolina, Indiana on Friday night at 9:57. And then we've got Notre Dame, Wisconsin just before that, Friday night at 7:27. So let's start with North Carolina and Indiana. Can't say I've watched both teams once all the way through, and that's because I am a Notre Dame fan. And North Carolina whooped Notre Dame, actually probably twice. They whooped Notre Dame in the ACC tournament just about a week ago, and they also lost to them once in the regular season. Those were the 2 games I watched of North Carolina all the way through. Indiana obviously has my boy Yogi at the point. I think point guard play is huge when you get to this point of the tournament. So if I had to pick, just as a guy that hasn't watched either team a lot, man, the athleticism that North Carolina has is scary. I think that with good, solid point guard play, controlled basketball, good shooting, I think that Indiana can get past North Carolina. This is another one. It's a coin flip for me. It's really hard for me to pick. I'll just go, and part of it is my heart wanting an all Indiana matchup in the next round. So I'm going to go with Indiana in this one. But at this point, nothing really is going to surprise me.
Right. And like I said, I think Indiana definitely, the way they looked the other night, it was strange to me because I felt like for the first maybe 25 minutes of that game or so that Yogi Ferrell was getting absolutely overwhelmed by Tyler Ulis from Kentucky. I mean, he seemed like he was getting beat off the dribble. He was kind of pressing offensively. And then at some point it was just slowly but surely he took back control of the game. And I mean, he did some amazing things down the stretch. And it was like this guy who I thought was having this horrible game for a good stretch of it suddenly just took over. And between him and Thomas Bryant, like I said, they kind of combined. He was getting Bryant a lot of good looks, and Thomas Bryant played out of his mind, especially for a young kid against Kentucky. But I have North Carolina moving on. Originally, this is the matchup I had. Watching them the other night against Providence, and Providence was a kind of a strange team also for me because they have sort of the 2 pros in Chris Dunn and Ben Bentel. But they could, Ben Bentel played amazing. Chris Dunn could be a little bit erratic. And North Carolina took advantage. I mean, they are starting to sort of come into their own again in a season where we, again, kind of keep pounding the drum of the fact that there's not really a standard elite team. North Carolina comes as close to it. I think the biggest thing that will kind of control whether or not they play their best or if they don't, again, are the guards, like you mentioned. If Yogi Ferrell can sort of control the game compared to Marcus Page for North Carolina, and Page has had his moments this year where he struggled to shoot from the perimeter. So that could be the matchup that kind of changes and decides, how this goes, because North Carolina is so reliant, I think, a lot of times upon Bryce Johnson just getting offensive rebounds, and he's definitely hard to keep off the boards. In the end, we'll have to do that. But I think I give the slight edge to North Carolina just simply because I think they have a little bit more talent up and down the roster, and they're sort of starting to put it together. But again, like I said, this tournament's nuts, so it could go either way there. But North Carolina by a hair.
Yeah, and I think what I was trying to get to that I sort of left out of what I was saying earlier was that part of the reason that I seem to be leaning in the direction of Indiana is because I think that Indiana's probably put together the most solid game from start to finish, I guess you could say, over a quality opponent so far this tournament. And you kind of touched on it, that Indiana is perhaps playing their best basketball of the year at this moment. And that doesn't mean they're going to beat North Carolina, because I think North Carolina is very good. But just to kind of reiterate my point there, I just kind of wanted to follow up because I didn't think I did a very good job of explaining that the first time around. So obviously another matchup that we will have close eyes on. I guess I should stop saying that because we're going to have it on all of them. But moving on then to the other half of the East regional bracket, which is Notre Dame and Wisconsin. I know a little bit about Wisconsin, not a lot. I am a Notre Dame fan, so I know a good bit about Notre Dame, although Notre Dame basketball isn't exactly what their football program is like. But I like the direction that Notre Dame continues to go with their basketball program. Another team that I think is on the upswing, kind of like I talked about Miami a little bit. I think that Notre Dame is big enough to get some good talent and also keep that talent for 3-4 years. So I think they've kind of benefited from this era of one and done a little bit. You saw them last year make an Elite Eight run and fall just short of beating Kentucky. I actually picked Notre Dame with my heart to win it all last year. Almost looked like a genius, but not quite. And they've got some guys back. They've got Demetrius Jackson, who I think is going to be a first-round pick in the NBA draft. They've got Zach August, who I'm not sure that Wisconsin has a guy that can guard Zach August in the post. And as I talked about on a podcast earlier this week, he's developed very nicely since being a really raw player. And then they've also got they've got a plethora of guys who can shoot the ball on the outside, whether that be VJ Beacham or the name's Steve Vasturia, or even Bonzi Colson's been very good. So I think Notre Dame has perhaps the edge here. I don't know a lot about Wisconsin's basketball team since they lost Sam Decker and Frank Kaminsky to the NBA. I think Notre Dame probably wins a little bit in the experience standpoint, even with their coach, Mike Bray. So I'm giving the edge to Notre Dame in this one.
Man, we keep agreeing on some of these. I think it's one of those nice sort of sections there of the bracket where you see that upset for Stephen F. Austin, and obviously that team played out of their mind. And Notre Dame, you went to comeback against Michigan to get to that point, and then you want to say, oh, how fortunate, Notre Dame got by their playing opponent, and then they get an upset. They get a team that pulled an upset, so this should be an easy one. Obviously, that was the furthest thing from the truth. But Notre Dame, with their experience, I think they're just flat out a better team from top to bottom on the roster than Wisconsin. That doesn't mean anything because Xavier was far and away better than Wisconsin also as far as actual talent. But Wisconsin kind of keeps on. They have experience with Bronson Koenig. I mean, the kid who hit the shot to win that game. Nigel Hayes is still there, so they have some pieces left over from the Final Four team last year, from the champion, the runner-up. But Notre Dame, you mentioned a number of the names, and I think Zach August, to your point, he was my key against Stephen F. Austin. I was actually surprised. I kind of said before that game started, if Notre Dame simply just pounded the ball into Zach August time and time again, I think they beat Stephen F. Austin, maybe not going away, but they beat him by 3-4 buckets, because I didn't think they had anybody who can guard him. And I think that's going to be very similar. If they focused on getting him the ball, I mean, he killed Kentucky last year in that game, and that team had a front line that he shouldn't have been able to take it to, and he did. So I think between, again, Demetrius Jackson with the experience running the point, they've kind of, again, they have that little bit of a charm to them that they survived a couple of really tough games. So I've got Notre Dame beating Wisconsin. I think that's that part of my bracket's already blown up as it is, because I did have Xavier in the Final Four originally, but I think Notre Dame's the better team there, and we'll get to meet up with North Carolina.
Okay. Yeah, no need to belabor that point. So let's go ahead then and move on to our last region, the Midwest. We've got Virginia versus Iowa State, and the perhaps surprise matchup at this point, Gonzaga and Syracuse. Let's start with Virginia, Iowa State. I believe you mentioned that you had Virginia winning it all. I'm not sure if that was on air or before we started recording or not, but was I correct in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did mention that last week too, I think on the podcast with Mike, that Virginia is especially not only from the standpoint, again, I think it's always great to have a little bit of a differentiator, but someone who can still win it from a bracket standpoint, that's always nice. But Virginia's legitimate. I mean, that team, again, you talk about experience. I want to say they have 5 seniors, so who knows what they're going to look like next year. But Tony Bennett's one of the better young coaches in the country. A lot of people don't like his style since it's so defensive. It's so, I guess, defense oriented. They play at a slow pace. They really don't want to. They don't want to pick up the tempo, and that's the only concern I have for them, is that they don't. If they get themselves in a position where they're behind, it's difficult for them to come back, because they really don't. They don't want to start having to run or to shoot threes constantly. They want to pound you with defense. They want to pound the ball inside, and Malcolm Brogdon kind of carves defenses up methodically, kind of inside and out. So it's going to be a really, really interesting dynamic between them and then Iowa State, who wants to do the exact opposite and get up and down the floor. They've actually got a lot of talent, and it's kind of interesting for them. And I had them actually going out in the first round only because they've had. I mean, last year they lost early in the tournament on the first day. I think they were the very first game of the day last year and lost to UAB. And I kind of thought they would have the same sort of hangover because they've been sort of up and down this year. But now they've sort of taken all that talent and they've gotten to this point. They have an opportunity, and they definitely have the talent that could take out Virginia. I just think that from a discipline standpoint, Virginia is far more disciplined. They'll control the tempo. They'll decide how it goes. And Iowa State tends to make mistakes when they come into a game like that. So I think Virginia gets by and hopefully takes one more step towards winning the championship that I think they will.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on this one again. Growing up through, the basketball program I played in high school and things, defense was always at the top of the mountain. And I love that in this era of, in the NBA, we talk about small ball and, having a distributor and having a lot of shooters and things. And college is kind of doing the same thing. It doesn't seem like there's anyone shooting from really mid-range anymore. It's all three-pointers and layups, and it's all quick. And in that era, I really love that Virginia is still finding a way to slow it down, making sure that defense is their number one priority, coming down, executing offense, set plays, and then just running like a motion type offense, good old-fashioned screen and roll basketball, things like that. And I love that Virginia is continuing to utilize that all the way to where they are right now. And then it's also hard for me to think that Iowa State, having lost Fred Hoiberg to the NBA and all the talent that they had on last year's team, even a team that lost on the first day of the tournament last year, hard for me to think that they're going to be able to get it past a team that's as disciplined as Virginia. So I got to agree wholeheartedly with you on that one, which then brings us to our last Sweet 16 matchup. And I got to admit to you, I know nothing about Gonzaga. And what I know about Syracuse is just about Syracuse of old. And the fact that they play that 2-3 zone, that still kind of boggles my mind. I don't know how Jim Boeheim even teaches them how to do that. It's the best zone probably in college basketball, how they are playing a zone, but they still find a way to be in all these passing lanes and be lengthy and just disrupt teams. And I was baffled by a statistic that I think was thrown at me when I was watching Syracuse take it to my alma mater of Dayton, where it says that Syracuse is, I don't remember what the exact percentage was, but the percentage of that teams are shooting from behind the arc against Syracuse is, I want to say it's either high 20s or low 30s. And that just baffles me from a team that plays exclusively 2-3 zone to be only giving up that percentage from the 3-point line. So I won't talk too much about this, about something that I don't know a lot about, but just with Jim Boeheim and that defense, I guess I would pick Syracuse. I'm assuming you have more to add to that than what I can offer.
I'll certainly give it a shot. And for this matchup in particular, this is where the one where we will differ, because I do like Gonzaga in this one. I had Gonzaga going out actually in the first round of Seton Hall. I overvalued what Seton Hall was doing at the end of the year. And we talked time and again tonight about experience, and Gonzaga certainly has that. They were an Elite Eight team last year. They have most of the pieces back from that. And Domantas Sabonis, Arvydas' kid, he's kind of just both games been the focal point and the dominant force for them. And I think you mentioned the Syracuse zone. He's the kind of guy who can still find some position on the interior of that zone and do a lot of things and kind of spray the ball around from inside out and get them some open looks. So I think Gonzaga, just from the standpoint of discipline, from experience, Mark Few. I mean, now Mark Few's been to 18 straight tournaments, which I think is crazy, given that Gonzaga was nowhere on the map prior to that point, and they've just been a staple in the tournament since then. And Syracuse, for me, I try not to get too caught up in it, but it does frustrate me because I'm a big fan of the mid-majors getting a couple extra teams in. I think the teams like Syracuse that finished 19-13 in the regular season should just be left out, because they have all year to try and beat big-name teams. They play in the ACC. They play top 25 teams constantly. If they can pick up 1, 2, 3 more big wins, they're in the tournament without a problem. But this is a team that's been up and down, and I know people talked about Jim Boeheim getting suspended for the first 9 games or whatever it was, and that impacted them. But honestly, that shouldn't matter. They should, that just goes on their resume, wins, losses, whatever it may be. But and they've played excellent. I got to think at some point that the Syracuse that was so up and down for most of the year, at some point here during the tournament, they'll be down again, or a team will just flat out play them. And I think this will be the spot where Gonzaga takes them out and finally shows that part of Syracuse what they were for most of the year.
Okay. All right. Well, you bring up some great points. Before we wrap up here, of the 16 teams that remain, pick me who's going to come out on top.
Well, I've got Virginia. That's my national title team. If I have to pick someone since my East Region Final Four team is out, I got to think North Carolina makes it through there. I've got Maryland out in the South. I've got Maryland not only going to the Final Four, but then meeting Virginia in the championship. And then, as I mentioned, I have Oklahoma getting through to the Final Four, at the very least, to get one game in the Final Four before I have Maryland taking them out, and then ultimately Virginia winning it against Maryland.
I really belabored that question. I knew you had Virginia. I'm not sure why I asked it, but thanks for taking it and running with it. And
no problem.
So, for me, as a guy that picked Michigan State to win it all, I think my new pick has got to be. I got to tell you, I am so impressed with Buddy Hield in Oklahoma. I really hadn't paid a whole ton of attention. I knew that Buddy Hield was pretty good, but I watched both games against that Oklahoma played this last weekend, particularly the one against VCU. I'm so impressed. I always like to pick a team that seems to be playing really well at the right time, and I think that might be Oklahoma this year. And I think in college basketball, more than like the NBA for sure, college basketball is a game where I think one guy can kind of will you a little bit. And I'm not really sure why that is exactly. So just for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and of the 16 teams remaining, pick Oklahoma. But, at this point, it would not surprise me if a team like Gonzaga won it all. It wouldn't surprise me one bit. So for what it's worth, I'm going to pick Oklahoma. And probably since I've said that, they'll stub their toe and lose at some point. But sorry in advance, Oklahoma fans. But real quickly, you've mentioned that you're a Louisville fan. Before we leave, just talk to me a little bit about what's going on with Louisville basketball right now.
Well, we're kind of in that holding period with obviously the scandal, trying to wrap up that investigation, and who knows with the NCAA whether or not they'll do that timely here over the summer, and they'll decide whether or not the offering that we gave as far as the 1-year ban, self-imposed ban is enough, and probably some sort of combination of loss of a scholarship or two, or maybe a suspension for Rick Pitino next year. And then I know before we started, you were talking about, a recent defection just yesterday. One of the recruits, we only have, I think, 2 recruits in the class right now as it is. But probably the second tier player that they got from Cleveland, Frankie Hughes, had decided to decommit and reopen his recruitment. And you had asked whether or not it was, if I thought it was based on the scandal or based on something else. And at least all indication right now is that simply a choice by him to find more playing time, thinking he's going to sit behind a couple of guys who are already in place for next year. And that's probably the most likely. I mean, and again, I don't begrudge any kid for deciding to make a choice if they can find a place to play. And I really don't think we'll see too much of concern on the recruiting front of the scandal impacting that too much, unless, like I said, suddenly we get hit with another year ban or a 2-year ban or something else ridiculous here in the summer. I think they'll kind of pick back up where they left off. And I mean, there's a lot of sort of irons in the fire as far as recruiting goes. And we're actually going to have a team back next year that's going to have a ton of experience, and I think would have done some damage in this year's tournament. So hopefully they're hungry, they're fired up, and they're ready to make a run next year, because they're going to have a lot of opportunity, a lot of skill on the team.
Yeah, certainly they will have you would think they'd have a chip on their shoulder for sure.
Right.
Last question real quick about this Louisville thing. Do you buy what Rick Pitino is saying about complete ignorance as to everything that's gone on there, or do you feel another way, or somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I mean, and we kind of had this discussion last week, I think, a little bit. I mean, I do buy that he didn't know, because there's kind of a couple ways you can look at it. Is these head coaches can intentionally not know things because they can just make sure they kind of stay away from, the extracurriculars, the things that are going on outside the basketball court, because they go home to the suburbs and they don't have to be around it. They can just make sure no one tells them. So that could be the case. I do believe Andre McGee obviously was probably involved in some way, but I think the thing that kind of drives me the most nuts about the entire process is that even though a lot of this may be true, and there was a sort of a book written, which was a 100-page kind of ridiculous pamphlet sort of book written with no discernible evidence. And I guess that's the hardest thing I have when you kind of, you get ridiculed. It is what it is. As a fan base, we're going to get ridiculed by outside fan bases because people want to see you fall. But until evidence is presented, you would think, hey, there's no guilt here until you can actually present something that's concrete. So I'm sure, like I said, the truth falls somewhere in the middle. I just want it to be proven if they're gonna penalize, but I don't know if that'll happen, because the NCAA sort of has their, they have their right to kind of do whatever they want. They don't really need kind of the same thing that we need in legal proceedings. They can sort of make a decision, and if it looks that way, they can penalize you.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up here?
No, just looking forward to a great tournament starting tomorrow night. I'll be locked in.
All right, well. I'm Ben. He's Damon. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out the Four Lights FM network on iTunes. Check us out at Campus Pressbox. Subscribe on iTunes. Write us a review. Do all of those good things. We're really trying to bump up the efforts here, make this a big thing. So if you'd help us out in that regard, we would appreciate it. As always, you can find us on Twitter, on Campus Pressbox, all of those things. Let us know what you think. Until next time, signing off.